Hello and welcome to the Decking Awesome podcast. My name is Brian and I'm joined by the awesome Ciara and Owen.
Hello.
Hi.
Or am I joined by them? Today we are trying out a new style of podcast where we're going to be debating different mechanics and parts of games that we just like and enjoy or dislike. Our first debate today is going to be about unique starting powers in games and different factions, whether they reduce the fun of a game or whether they kind of pigeonhole you into playing one different route. So with us today, in the red jumper, weighing in at one donut heavier than he was 5 minutes ago, the man who's hated starting faction since he lost a game of hopscotch to a kid with 3 legs, taking the stance against, it's Owen!
Yay, it's me. I love donuts. I know.
And in the blue jumper, weighing in at, I can't. Yeah, also here, the woman who once superglued a fake extra leg to a child just to see Owen lose at hopscotch, taking the stance in favor, it's Ciara!
Woo!
So, for this podcast, each person is going to kind of lay out their arguments in favor or against, and we'll give the other person a chance to argue against it. I will also talk more because, I don't like just sitting here quietly. So, we are going to focus on kind of games where players are all playing against each other. We feel like cooperative games like Pandemic and Gloomhaven and stuff like that. It's fun to have different factions because you're all playing together and cooperative. So this is more about, do starting factions give different players advantages? So, Ciara, talk to us a bit about some pros in favor of different starting factions.
Cool. So my main love of starting factions is to stop people doing the exact same thing every time we play a game. There are certain strategies that we play games, the three of us together, and the three of us all have set styles that we love and we constantly resort to whenever we're playing a game that we play a lot. So I think the worst one we have is Stone Age. Whenever we play Stone Age, we resort to the same strategies each time. One of us always goes for just the science cards, and one of us always goes for trying to have the most people and most wheat, and one of us tries to build as many huts as is possible within the length of the game and tries to get to the bottom of the hut stacks as quickly as possible. So we're very predictable when we play, and I think that just kind of reduces down the quality of the gameplay, even though Stone Age is probably one of my favorite games. Yeah, so that is my strong proposal for why having random factions helps, is that random factions means you really have to play, or well, you don't have to, but it really helps to play towards the strength that the starting faction gives you. So it means that you can be sure that if everyone takes a random starting faction, that they will be potentially forced to be a bit more flexible or try some things that they wouldn't normally try in their gameplay. And it means that the game doesn't always end the same way.
Yeah, true. That kind of reminds you of like Pandemic and stuff like that, where you'd have like starting factions. But even when Pandemic though, there is that kind of, if there is a very balanced game, everyone picks a starting player. In the case of randomly starting players, that makes a lot more sense. But yeah, Stone Age is really good. It gets replayed so much because it's such a competitive game, but it's so well balanced. But yeah, I think having balance in the starting players is such an important thing, especially for randomly associated starting factions.
So, Owen taking an early opening, backing Ciara up on her points. An unusual tactic for a debate. I like it. So, Owen, would you say that, you'd be opposed to opening factions? You like to be a creature of habit. You like to play the same strategy if you think you've found a winning one.
I think the problem I have with starting factions, is when it comes down to player choice. Like Ciara was saying that, people do get stuck into a kind of rhythm in Stone Age where they kind of keep constantly picking the same style of strategy. Kind of different players will mix things up themselves. Some players, if they find a thing that they can kind of get good at, they'll keep pushing away at it. The problem I find though with stuff like Terra Mystica and kind of Lords of Waterdeep is starting players tend to do the opposite. They'll tend to actually, because there's so many choices in the game and so many different types of strategies, people just tend to just pick their starting faction. And they will, whatever the best option for that starting faction is, they will just only do that, even if it's against what they kind of want to play or how they play. They'll just go that just to hope that they'll win through the power of their starting faction. So although the game could have lots and lots of choice, lots of different kind of varied mechanics, the starting factions limits their choice. So they really don't have a choice at all.
Does that not add to the replayability though? So because you're trying out things maybe you didn't try out last time in the game, you're making choices. Sure, you're being forced to make them because of your starting faction. But in Lords of Waterdeep, for example, let's say your starting faction was Piety. And, you know, it kind of means that when you're trying to decide on whether you're going to take a Skullduggery card, you can kind of really, it makes you think about it a bit more and weigh up the options better. Gives you a different angle than you would have played last time for the pros and cons.
That's true from a player perspective. Each player gets to try out all the different styles of play and different mechanics. I think even just playing a game once, such a Stone Age where there is no starting factions, you'll just by seeing other people playing the game, you should get a good idea as to what different strategies work in a game. Which, you know, for something like Lords of Waterdeep, it can show you that certain strategies are a lot better, and certain factions are a lot better, which can be quite frustrating. You know, if you start the game, you pick up a starting faction, and it says you're Piety, and you've played this game so many times that you know the construction of your group and how they play, that Piety just is not going to win. It can be pretty hurtful and hard to play.
But is that not the same thing as trying to find the best strategy in a normal game? Like, there has to be a way that Piety can win, right? It just needs to tweak well.
No, in Lords of Waterdeep, it just sucks. We can just accept that. And you get so little reward from it. You put all your time and effort into getting it because that's what your starting faction benefits or bonuses you for. But, you know, unless you rack up a huge amount of them, does it really benefit you in the long run?
Yeah, it's a really tough one because we're kind of describing balance of mechanics. You know, if you balance the starting powers, would the same be true? So in Lords of Waterdeep, if all the characters, all the factions were balanced, would it help kind of how Stone Age, all the different strategies are balanced? Kind of. Wheat is usually better, but let's not go there. Yeah, it's about the balance of the game. The problem is that starting powers tend to just like strip out that balance to it almost means the rest of the game doesn't matter. It's just the starting faction. If the starting faction isn't balanced straight away, it can feel like you've lost. But in a game where like Stone Age, even though wheat isn't balanced, you got a chance to get your own wheat, you know?
I think that in our games, we know that wheat is unbalanced. And I guess the one thing about playing the same rules every time is we all try and get wheat now. No one is allowed to take all the wheat. Whoever's the first player gets the wheat.
That was my strategy. And I was kicking ass. You guys just keep stealing it.
You lost like 6 times before that strategy started to work.
Yeah, but once I figured it out, but there's an example. So that's not a starting strategy, but that's a game that doesn't have starting factions, and yet we've clearly found one path that seems to work the best. So everyone tries to go for this one faction. So would that not be in favor of starting powers? You know, if I in Stone Age, if I had an advantage towards using tools, I'd focus more on tools than just going down the wheat route, like we often always seem to. Because, you know, if you don't have to worry about players gathering food, then you can focus your players on getting resources. So maybe that's a case where, you know, starting factions would benefit a game as opposed to just being a hindrance.
You do have the problem of if there is a Stone Age faction that collects wheat, it's just not that faction is going to be picked all the time. Waterdeep has one where if you're a builder, you get 4 points or 6 points or something like that. Now, building obviously is super competitive, but if you're playing a 2-player game, if you're playing a low player count game, you can build quite a lot of buildings, even though it is really like competitive. Higher player count, it's much more difficult. So I think maybe certain player factions are more balanced in different player counts. I would just recommend just rip up that builder player faction. Just don't play with it. Just
Unfortunately, throughout the pandemic, we've been playing online, and you can't just tell the computer to rip up that card. It still assigns building to somebody every time. So another one of the pros that I think in this is analysis paralysis, which I think is a debate that we constantly have between the three of us, because I'm blamed constantly on taking too long in my goes. And yet Owen and Brian also take a really long time in certain games to have a go and make us sit around.
I'm going to have to interject there because you're right. Owen does take a long time as well. Continue with your point, please.
I do. I'll agree to that.
Brian does too sometimes. If he
That's not the debate. That's not what we're debating. We're not debating analysis paralysis and who has it, okay?
Okay, sorry. But having a certain faction means that there's less of that at the start of a new game. I think that because you have something, you haven't played a game too often, maybe you only played it once or twice, you forget what the winning strategy is because it's been so long, and you're given a certain faction. It just means that your goals take less time because you're focused on one task or another, and that gives you something to try and figure out. Whereas starting a game like Gaia Project and not having a starting faction means you look at 500 choices on the board and you have no idea what to do.
Okay, so
yeah,
Owen, as someone who's sat there and watched Kira analyze over decisions and turns, not me, of course, but would you not be in favor of, starting factions giving people a direction to follow?
You do get to the problem of, in Gaia Project, you have 500 choices. The starting faction just means it's 501. So it doesn't help a whole lot. It does mean that your one choice of the player faction is so powerful that you're kind of not even looking at the other stuff. But at the same time, that can kind of be a hindrance because sometimes the winning goal or the winning strategy might have nothing to do with your faction. I remember Kira had a faction. She started with Gaia Project. She had a building faction where she had to go around building. She was trying to get her faction to kind of utilize that faction power. It never came to fruition. And if maybe she didn't have that faction at all, she could have focused on the other 500 options, which probably would have caused more analysis paralysis. You're right. But maybe she would have won.
Okay, that's a fairly good point. That starting factions don't necessarily guarantee you a victory. Maybe they just say, here's another option to consider when you're already trying to figure out a mass of things happening on a board.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a very tricky one to kind of get, because analysis paralysis is just about playing the game as much as possible and knowing how deep a game is. And sometimes for your first few plays of a game, you might just have to kind of play and not worry about your faction, maybe for the first round or for the first game, and then start worrying about your faction later on. But then, it really depends on the game, I suppose.
And I'd go that maybe when you're playing your first few games, just go with whatever the starting faction power is and try and use it. Because at least then you don't have to worry about 500 things. You're only worrying about 10 things that aren't going to work.
Yeah. Well, Gaia Project has a problem of the factions definitely are not being balanced. So there are like really good factions and really bad factions, but I don't know if that was meant to happen or not. But you can always just tier the factions and play with the higher tier factions, the ones that are really powerful, and then sometimes play with the really worse ones. I think Gaia Project doesn't. So I have another con point on this debate, which it's not related to this. To Gaia Project, it's the fact that some starting powers are hidden, and this happens in certain games. I think the obvious one that we use is Lords of Waterdeep, where everyone has a hidden faction. It takes a while to learn. You generally speaking, you learn about halfway through whose factions are what based on what quests they picked up, or if they're not picking up any quests, then they're probably doing something else. So that one is tricky because it's just you're putting in this kind of end game scoring where people are not really sure what the end game scoring is or what the kind of choices that people are forced to do. To me, I would just pick starting factions as always face up, and you can always see them. I don't really see the point in hidden starting factions at all, but I don't see the point in starting factions at all either. So I don't know, it's a tough one.
Okay, so the secrecy of the factions or the secrecy of the starting powers is a big con because players can't work against you. They can think they're doing great throughout the game, but in reality that you're 50 points ahead of them. But if they'd twigged that earlier on, they might have done something to stop you or slow you down or interrupt what you were doing. So maybe face up starting factions if everyone always knew what the other players were doing. But does that work, Kira?
I just want to add one more thing to this. Sorry, is that if you use our example of Stone Age and the wheat again, if the starting powers in Stone Age were face down, and we didn't know who the wheat starting faction was, okay, we wouldn't be able to counteract it the same way we do wheat attacks on Stone Age. Whereas if everyone had face up certain factions in Stone Age, which I know it doesn't exist, we'd be able to attack the weak guy because we know the weak guy has more power than everybody else right at the start of the game, and we could balance it ourselves.
So I'm going to go for, I like a little bit of intrigue. Now, I will agree that where starting factions have a massive amount of point differential, that they might add like 50 points to the game. I'm not a big fan of that, unless everyone could add 50 points for a variety of different reasons. But in a game where they only add a few points, and Lords of Waterdeep doesn't add an enormous amount of points, but I have won because of my starting faction before, on I think a few occasions. So I'm a little bit biased, but I like the secret. I like having a minor secret that does impact the game somewhat. So it means that a worker placement game, which are like my favorite type of games, has a little bit of intrigue and a little bit of player interaction to try and figure something out. In Stone Age, you can generally see everything that somebody is doing. And I like that sometimes, but also other times I like to have a little bit of trying to figure something out or trying to puzzle a way out of something. So I like the layer that it adds on the intrigue element. But where it adds, I'll agree that it can cause a game to be very unbalanced if there's a really, really big benefit point-wise in a worker placement game to having a secret starting faction. Like in games like Cold Express, so you were talking about having the faction type face up. That's one where you have to counteract some of them. I feel like I know, Brian, this is one of your big games. When you play with Ghost, though, we don't play with Ghost anymore because it's a super unbalanced card. Having that one face-down card at the start is almost impossible to deal with.
For our listeners who've never played Colt Express, it's like a programming game where you each take turns telling your characters what to do, and they don't do everything until the end. So if you can follow along with what players are playing, you can kind of predict where they're going to be or anticipate. Ghost is a character where he plays his first card face down. So you literally have no idea where he's gone. You know, maybe afterwards he's running to the right, or you know he's going to rob something, but you don't know where he is when he starts it. So it makes it very hard to predict. No other character in the game has that ability. They all have different interactions with each other, or they all have different bonuses for gaining stuff, but Ghost essentially is impossible as a character to predict what's happening. So he's one where even having face-up factions where everyone knows what's happening, he still has an enormous advantage.
Yeah, he is definitely, if he's in the game and we're playing with enough players that we have to bring him in, we literally just have to, he has to be defeated constantly. If somebody can like mess with him on their go, they tend to mess with him on their go because he's probably already in the lead and has stolen things.
It's weird because Cold Express is actually a great example of it. So in that case, you have a hidden kind of card at the start. Not really kind of what we're talking about with the starting factions being hidden, but every starting faction has a specific power. And in Cold Express, you also have like a day thing where the cards are shown and displayed in a different way each day, or they're done in different rounds. So that, like, you know, we never really know what the next card is. If you're trying to hunt someone down, it's really difficult because you're not sure if you're going to make it in time or if your programming is going to work out. But the Ghost card is really powerful. In Cold Express, if you took out the starting factions, I think the game wouldn't be as fun, okay? But because you took out the starting factions, the developers could have put more risk into, say, like doing different cooler things on those day trackers. So instead of having like the second card face down, they could go like 3 cards face down, or they could have it in totally new ways, or they could have rounds where punching takes people's money and then you pick it up immediately, kind of like what the Native Americans woman's power is. So all those kind of things, instead of those faction powers being a specific person and then a Ghost always winning, everybody has that starting power faction, like, you know, power on the board, but it appears at different times.
Well, there's another point. So do starting factions, like if you know a player has a powerful starting faction, does that make them a target in the game? Because whenever I get Ghost, I love it because you guys don't know what I'm doing. So I have a very big advantage over you guys. But because of that, you guys focus on getting me. So I now am playing a game against all of you combined. So while I have the advantage of the character, I have the disadvantage of everyone coming after me. So does a strong faction, you know, kind of balance itself out? Does it almost work as a disadvantage?
Well, I'm on the con side of starting powers reducing fun, so I think yes.
Nice.
But no, if we're being serious about it, though, I think the starting powers are the mechanics of the powers can be fun, but the problem is because they're associated with a specific person, that seriously reduces the fun, because you could have those mechanics done in different places inside the game instead, and they could allow anybody to get the powers. And it's just like, how if you're playing a game where there's no starting factions and one guy's on 100 points and you're on 70 points and another guy's on 60 points, they're going to try and do king making on you and try and bring you back from 100 all the way down, regardless of what the board situation is or what starting powers are. So you're always going to get that problem of one person just being better or being luckier earlier on in the game, and you're going to have that pull and take. But because it's a starting power thing, that happens immediately. Round one, very start of the game, everyone's going for Ghost. The game hasn't even started yet. That's the thing that kind of worries me.
And I don't necessarily disagree with that. So I think that starting factions are a great idea. I do not think that a highly unbalanced starting faction helps or hinders a game. I think that, especially for hidden, they have to be minor. They have to be something reasonable. They can't be this massive, one person can just kick ass and then everyone else is just fighting to take them down. I don't necessarily think that factions should be something that mean that you have to form alliances just so that you can win, or they shouldn't force you to change the style of game into a different type of game. I think that does ruin the fun, because you're playing a worker placement game and you want to play that sort of game. You didn't play a deception or intrigue game. You're not playing coup or any of the other ones. You're playing a game that's a worker placement game. So it should just be something that enhances it and forces you to think of new strategies and new challenges. Something that having that starting faction is more of a thing to broaden your ideas of what it is to play a game, and not, if Ghost is on the table, we all need to stop Ghost.
Yeah, I think having hidden secret starting factions is how kind of developers decided to fix that problem, which I think it in some cases it does. Say Lords of Waterdeep, no one knows who the builder is at the start of the game, so no one's going to go against that person. No one's going to try and find them out. The only problem is halfway through the game, it tends to become obvious whose secrets are what, which I love that mechanic. I love finding out hidden things about players. The only problem is once you find that information out, then say if I'm the builder, I might be losing, because I usually lose at Waterdeep. So I might be losing and everyone's still going to pick on me because they think I'm winning. And so I'll profess my case and say, yes, I'm the builder, but I'm actually losing. So I don't know who's going to win, but it's not going to be me. So don't pick on me. So it kind of delays that effect. So instead of it happening at round one, where everyone's attacking Ghost, it happens at round 5 when everyone realizes I'm the builder. But it is a cool mechanic. I do love this secret identity. I love finding things out with the players, but not through starting powers or factions.
I think that there's also, you can play against it as well. So like, sometimes I like to just build a lot of things in Lords of Waterdeep. I like the benefits that people using your buildings have, even if I'm not the builder. And that sometimes causes a lot of confusion around whether I have the building. Because I think before I did a lot of building and I wasn't the builder. And then I won just because people weren't really paying attention that much. They assumed they were trying to stop me building things. I just like that element. I like that element of there just being a little bit of something.
I will say that the starting powers, they do kind of work better, this lighter the touches when it comes to starting powers. So games like Terra Mystica, where it's almost central to the whole reason of the game, you can see a much bigger swing in the balance between the different starting factions. But then the lighter the touches, so things like Terraforming Mars, because they're so only a very starting bonus, almost a starting bonus only kind of aspect to it, they are much kind of more engaging, and they just put everybody in a different starting spot and say go ahead, and then you all have different, almost slightly different starts, so your whole end game is going to be slightly different. But even considering that, I would just say just get rid of them all completely. If they get better with a lighter touch, then just take it out. Just
Is there not some games where like having wild, chaotic starting powers, add a big element of fun to the game? Where like if everyone is running off in different directions doing just crazy stuff, is that not more fun? Is it not brings a whole wild, chaotic element to the game?
Santorini is one of the games that we absolutely love that involves wild starting powers. But I think Santorini is quite almost a bland game without the starting powers. I think it's it's simpler than chess. It's fun, but it's not as intriguing. And then you have these really powerful characters like Apollo in Owen's hands. Just constantly fills the board with those little blue tops. Blue tops everywhere.
Roofs everywhere.
It's really fun. It kind of, but to me, doesn't that kind of slightly ruin Santorini? Because I love being Atlas, and but once I'm Atlas, I don't really care what everyone else is, and I'm just going to do my thing. So it doesn't look like a Santorini board by the end of it.
But without the extra powers, I just don't think the game has enough pull. I like trying to figure out how each of the characters, like Athena and Aphrodite, how they would oppose each other, as opposed to always thinking, oh, well, Owen constantly tries to build up something in the corner, or Brian maybe tries to build up something in the corner and block himself off from everything. I can't remember which of you does it. But I know one of you does.
That's me. I like kind of secluding myself, and then you can't do anything to stop me. You can't get into me. I'm just going to win in like 8 turns.
So I like trying to figure out how you would stop the other person doing it, even though I know you both have like a strategy you tend to like, and so you have to worry about that strategy. Depending on the player or the character you get, you tend to adjust that to something different each time. So it's fun to figure out how I could use the character that I got at random to oppose that, because I think it has to be at random in that game, doesn't it? I think you shuffle the gods, so it makes it more interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Santorini, I know I shouldn't be agreeing in the debate, but
you guys have both done a lot of it. You've done a lot of agreeing with each other for
but my points are still
points.
Against I think we can still be against the main topic, but I think Santorini is a fantastic game where starting powers are kind of core to it. I think when we're talking to other games, the other games like Stone Age and Terra Mystica and stuff like that, they have a lot of randomness in it, and it's that randomness that makes it competitive and kind of engaging. So in Santorini, the game itself, the rules are really straightforward, and so you play a couple of games without any powers just to understand what the game is, and then you bring in the powers. I would say it's a trickier game because it needs a lot more focus and development to take out the starting powers. You'd need some way of randomly giving people abilities as they do things. So like, if they build a level 1 dome, a level 1 thing, they get a power. But there needs to be some other way of doing it. But yet, even in Santorini, the powers are so vastly different that if you get a power that you don't like, I don't know if you're going to have as much fun. Now, in saying that, when I get Atlas, I have so much fun, and it's really cool to see the interaction between players. I wouldn't call it balanced.
But Atlas doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win. It doesn't mean you're going to destroy the board. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll win, though.
I don't usually win.
You just stop everyone else from winning easily by destroying everything.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And you're just as likely to trap yourself behind your walls of blue things as you are to trap anyone else behind anything. Yeah. So I just find that quite a lot of fun. I think that starting power just adds a lot of fun to the game. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win or lose, even though it's an incredibly powerful starting power. But because all the other ones, like, move to the edge and build when you're anywhere on the board, like, that's crazy. That's like, if you use that well, it means you have a load of skills that you have to, if you get any of the different gods, you have to try and think of a strategy that's going to win with them. And that just means that you're always on your toes. You're always thinking a few moves ahead to try and take advantage of that thing.
I don't know if we go into Santorini when we play it to have a competitive, engaging game where we're trying to figure out who the winner is. It's not like chess or something like that, where 2 people will go in and then we'd see who is like better. But it's more of just, I don't know. It's on the edge of like competitive and cooperative. I don't even know how I'd explain it, but we're not going in there to see who the best is. Like Terra Mystica, it's really to see who can terraform the most sand dunes. I don't know.
Who can terra the most Mystica?
Yeah. So I don't know how I'm trying to say, but I don't think you can frame Santorini in the same light as the other ones. But like starting faction is the whole point of Santorini, whereas a game like Stone Age, the whole point of it is a competitive game to see who can live in the Stone Age times.
I'm not sure you know what any of these games are about, really.
Okay, so like, do some games need starting factions? Like we're saying, Santorini is it's pretty much the same game every time without the different gods who throw in chaos into it.
I was just going to say that if you're looking for a competitive game to see who the best is at Santorini, you probably wouldn't do it with the starting factions. If you were trying to do it like just as a pure skill kind of chess game. Now, I'm not saying that'd be fun, but it would tell you who's better at it. And this is, I think this probably the same could be true for like Terra Mystica or Lords of Waterdeep, where if you took out the starting factions, you would find out who the best player is. But, you know, I do think those games would be, I don't know, for me, it would be more fun because I know it'd be more balanced. I don't know if everybody would agree with that, but I think the starting, you know, if you didn't have those starting factions, you still have the randomness and the chaos and the player interaction that you'd still have, and also have more choice as to, you're not limited by your starting factions. So
I think that you're only getting fun from, you're removing areas where you're getting fun from. So like, you're not checking in those situations what the adaptability of that player is. You're only checking their skill at one of the features in the game. So in Santorini, you're not checking how adaptable and versatile the player is to win. You're just saying that they are good at placing blocks in a weird set of rules. In Lords of Waterdeep, you're saying they are good at understanding what the most efficient way of getting points is. But like, are you really testing out how good they are at winning the game, how good they are at adapting to new situations? Like, isn't that part of the whole like winning of the game is and like fun of the game is seeing how a player can deal with a changing landscape? Like, I like that, yeah.
I agree with that. I think some games offer that better than others. So Terra Mystica, I don't think your strategy would change a whole lot. Obviously, in Santorini, you would not, the strategy would not change at all, and you'd have moves like the Queen's Gambit, all that kind of stuff at the very start, because they'd be so well defined if you didn't have certain powers. But Lords of Waterdeep, though, is a good example, I think, of where it could actually increase the fun, because if you didn't have piety and the piety starting faction didn't exist, and you were playing the game, and the 4 quests that came out were all piety, and you're thinking to yourself, all right, I don't usually play piety, because I never get the chance because the cards never come out. And then you see 4 piety quests, and you've picked up a couple of piety quests yourself from your starting hand. You're thinking to yourself, yeah, this could work. And then you try piety for that time, and you see how it works. And then you're still doing the piety starting faction, although it was your own choice, and it was the role of the cards. And you're adapting to what the player start off is.
In Lords of Waterdeep is if you aren't focused towards one type of quest, are you not just going to find that everyone goes for the highest point quest every time?
Yeah, but I think Lords of Waterdeep is balanced enough that if one person takes the highest point of quest, other people, there's still synergies in the cards. So there's cards that have like constant use cards where you pick up a skullduggery card and it lets you do some bad things for cheaper later on. So you'll always have that kind of synergy between cards. I think Lords of Waterdeep is a little bit different because you still get cards at the start of your game. So imagine my starting faction is the piety one, and then I pick up 5 cards, and they're like 5. I think it's 5 cards, is it? When you start
2
off,
cards, I think it is.
It's only 2, is it?
Cards. Yeah.
I can't
2,
remember.
5. They're both the same number, just upside down.
Because you have mandatory quests as well. But when you pick up those cards, if they're not your starting faction cards, then you've got a really tough choice to make of going, should I even care about these quests that I just picked up? Because they're not my quests. Whereas if you didn't have a starting faction and then you picked up 2 skullduggery quests, you'd be like, all right, guys, I'm a rogue now. I'm gonna be doing roguish stuff. Maybe you could solve that problem 2 ways. You could either have no starting faction or no picking up quests.
And I would have thought, yeah, that's just the same thing.
Well,
that's the saying that there's ways in which light-hearted factions, if they're only a small influence, because I guess the difference between the starting faction and the quest cards is your bonuses tend to be much smaller. So like if you do a skullduggery quest, you only get 2 victory points for every additional skullduggery quest you do, if that's what the reward is. Whereas, or maybe it's 1 victory point and it might be 4 as the starting faction. You think I can remember the points, but actually I can't remember how many points you get for any of those things. But
it's 4. It's 4 for the starting faction, and then I don't know, it's like 1 or 2 or something. You're right though. If you have starting faction you're going to go with Skullduggery. But if you didn't have the starting faction and you has those two cards, you still have the cards that are laid out on the board, which means that the choice between becoming Skullduggery and not, it's a harder choice to make because you have to start thinking about everyone else. And what I'm trying to say is it's not a round one decision. And also, no one will really know if you're Skullduggery throughout the entire game because you'll never be 100% Skullduggery. You'll always be like 60%. You'll touch on piety a little bit. You can mix and match the kind of things a little bit more. But you are right that if a 23 story point or 23 pointer quest comes out, everybody's going to want it. But that's really the same case, I think, with starting factions. Just people tend to go for their own.
I think anyone would pick up a 23 point or the 25 point quests. I think that all bets are off on your starting faction versus those.
That's probably true. People aren't going to go, I'm not getting the bonus 4 points for that, so I'm just going to ignore those 20-something points. Yeah.
I think the only issue you might have with this is at the start of the game, if no one has a faction, then you might just, like, if I go purple, Brian goes the orange guys, Kira kind of has to go black, and then isn't that kind of deciding what your starting faction is there? But that might be better than just the starting factions being piety, because at least if I go white and Kira's piety, I've just taken her piety, I didn't realize it, and now you're on the bad foot. Or we might be competing over the same resource and Brian might not be. He might be free reign to just build as his heart content and then just win. So it's a tough one.
That's true. So let me ask you this. What about games that have starting factions where, they're not really beneficial? So like, look at the likes of Roll for the Galaxy. Roll for the Galaxy gives you a different starting faction for every player where, you might get extra advantages for building this type of planet, or, you get bonuses for shipping or stuff like that. Whereas, the game ends when someone builds 10 planets. So is there not a tactic there to just build as many planets as possible, build the highest value planets you can, and just focus on building 10, and then you have the best chance of winning? It doesn't matter if someone's getting, 2 extra bonus points for shipping, or someone's getting an extra dice because you've finished your 10 planets. Is that a game where starting factions are pointless? Do you need them?
I think it's 12 planets.
12 planets, sorry.
And I believe that you think this because you win a lot
with
all
this tactic. The time with that tactic.
I don't think you win as much as you used to. Now that we know that that's your tactic. Which is why I think certain factions are important. I think that there are like strategies that work that transcend starting factions in some games. I think Roll for the Galaxy is one of them. If you can balance, somebody with 5 planets, or maybe not 5 planets, 8 planets can beat your 12 planets if those 8 planets are really high scoring planets. And that has, I think, been the thing that catches people up with using the same strategy each time. But the point, I think, is that having different starting factions means that it can't just be build this, there's a good chance somebody's going to have a starting faction that they are really good at using, or that they can think of a really good way, and they can stop just the same way of winning each time, which makes it a little more fun and means that the same thing doesn't work every time. I don't know that building 12 planets would work every time. I think you can just catch people unawares.
Yeah, it doesn't. I try and do that all the time and I lose a lot. But I might just be doing it wrong. It's a fun game. I like rolling dice. That's really why I'm there.
I love rolling dice. I think that really adds to it.
So everyone agrees picking up like 20 dice and dumping them on the board all at once.
Yeah, it's
the
pretty
best
good.
bit of that game.
Yeah.
The 2 things that you get at the start, or 1 or 2, I can't remember. It's kind of like a 2 block, but like it can be 1 power and stuff. They tend to be no more powerful than a normal tile. So like in that game, your starting faction is just so that you don't start with 0 resources or 0 anything. It's not really.
But then is it even worth having starting factions in the game if they're so minimal that they're essentially pointless?
I think Roll for the Galaxy is a tricky one because it can be really complicated to figure out how the best solution is, because you're building a machine, but you're not really sure when it's going to pay off. If you haven't played the game enough, you're going to be building your shipping routes and you're going to be putting trading things down on planets, and you'd be like, cool, I have a little system going here. All I need to do is ship out. Oh, the game's over. Oh, I have 0 points. Oh. And you have completely misjudged the situation. I don't know if starting powers are going to help that at all or even affect it, but I do know that the Roll for the Galaxy starting powers are pretty random. There's a lot of them. They're kind of all over the place, and they do kind of push you down a specific path.
Yeah, I was Space Pirates 3. The first 3 games of it I played out of Space Pirates, and I hated Space Pirates. I didn't want to be Space Pirates, and they were random. We literally shuffled those cards each time, and every time I randomly got Space Pirates. So it's either a really complicated ploy by Owen and Brian to upset me terribly.
The other solution is just don't. When it says have randomly shuffle out cards, don't. Just do whatever you want. It's your game. You can just choose whatever factions you want.
Well, is that not a good argument against having starting factions in a game where you know what the starting factions are, or where you have one that you really like, you know which ones are crap, you know which ones are good? If you get a bad starting faction, does that not take away from the fun of the game from the word go?
I think that I just was unlucky. I don't mind getting Space Pirates 3 times in a row, though, randomly out of all the tiles. Just sucked.
But that one example aside, like look at any other game with starting factions where you have one you like or you have one you think is crap. If you're dealt that from the word go, does that not take away from the fun of the game? You're already starting, on a bad foot. Would the game not be more fun if you didn't start on a negative?
I don't think it's that straightforward. I think there are some badly balanced cards in any game, but there's badly balanced rules in games. I'll give you a very old example. We traveled the world for 5 months back many years ago, and we had to take out cards. We only brought like 4 games, and they were all card games, and one of them was Monopoly card game, which was probably a bad idea, but we this is before we were into board games that much, and we had a very limited amount of games, and we had to take out cards from that game and just get rid of them or change the rules on them because they were so rubbish. If one of them was like you could just win a whole section or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but it gave you 3 cards and whoever got it won. And like that is a problem with that game. That game just has a badly balanced card in it that shouldn't be in that deck.
Some starting factions do reduce fun.
Yes.
I win!
Good debate, guys. Good debate. We'll condense it down to those 5 minutes. It was fun.
Perfect.
Some certain factions are badly balanced, but like some components in games are badly balanced. Like you can't say starting factions are bad just based on some really bad examples of them being implemented. Starting factions would add a lot to Stone Age. Starting factions do add a lot to Santorini, and they do add a lot to, and I think they do add a lot to Waterdeep. I actually think that Lords of Waterdeep is a good game. I disagree that I think the deck is too big. But I like the fact that you have starting factions. I enjoy that I have to figure out what other people's starting factions are. I think that Lords of Waterdeep would be worse if it didn't have starting factions. And I don't think that having those 2 quests would be enough. I think that if everyone got to pick based on the cards that were out on the table, it'd be too transparent. If you only got 2 quest cards and 4 quest cards came out and you picked between them, everyone would see more of your hand than they see in a normal game. So they would just be able to guess what you're planning, and they'd be able to tell what you have bonuses for so transparently that there'd be nothing to try and figure out.
Yeah, but the thing is, in Lords of Waterdeep, it doesn't take you that long to figure out who's what. So if someone makes 3 piety quests, they know they're the piety guy. So they're gonna block piety anytime they can. Like if 4 piety come out and that person's winning, they're gonna clear the board. The problem is if there's no starting factions and the person picks up 3 piety, that could just be their early game. You fall into my trap. I am not doing piety mid game or late game. I'm changing my tactics. So in that case, you can always or you can also just if someone tries to remove the piety stuff, you're not winning on piety. Piety doesn't change it at all. So not having starting factions would help a lot. I would say on the point of Roll for the Galaxy though, the starting factions are really random, but I find anyway that everything is random in Roll for the Galaxy. You got the dice you're going to roll, which is super random. Then you're picking up planets, which all different colors, doing all sorts of different things. But then with abilities and developments that are all super different as well, it means that you almost have no choice ever. You get a whole lot of things, and you're like, okay, I'll put this blue planet beside this red ability. I don't know what I can do. So maybe that's not the best example of Roll for the Galaxy.
So, Owen, what about games like Villainous? Villainous is, it's more or less a multiplayer solitaire game where everyone's trying to achieve different tasks, different goals. Sure, they can interact with each other, but for the most part, you're trying to complete your own little quest. The starting factions in there give different people different unique advantages, but it's one that benefits them, but not necessarily hinders other players. Does something like that not work quite well?
It's been a long time since I played Villainous, so I don't know.
Concise. I like it.
I just
Point
can't
to Kira.
remember Villainous. That's not how this works. Probably not. How about that? Probably not.
Oh,
okay.
Half a point to Kira. What about, Owen? Can you give me an example of a game where you like the starting factions, where you think it really benefits the game itself?
I think a good example of that is probably Terraforming Mars. I love the idea of It's a very light touch. Now, the rest of the game I don't like. Don't get me wrong, but I like this. I like the starting factions of it. The fact that it sets up the game based on what kind of corporation you are coming onto Mars is great. But also the fact is, in Terraforming Mars, they have a default faction, okay, or a default starting power, and this is it's what beginners play. Beginners pick one, and they all go, and everybody can be that starting faction. Or someone who's more advanced could try a different one. And they let people go off on their merry way and try a different strategy if they want to. The best thing about this is, first of all, it doesn't cause everybody to pick on one guy. So even if one guy picks a new corporation and they're trying a new tactic, not everyone's going to pick on that person because of their faction. Because they don't really affect the game too much. Because there's no powers that they have through the game. But the fact is they have a default faction that everybody can pick. And I think like games like Lords of Waterdeep would be might solve the problem if they had a default faction that, say, gave them 4 points for doing something else.
Or that gives them 2 points for every quest.
2 points for every quest and for every building they build. Something like that. Just a point for everything. That could work. But at that point, you're really talking about not having a faction at all. So in that case, I would just be like, in Terraforming Mars, it sounds like a faction, but really it's just a starting off point. And if you just had no factions at all, and you just said everybody gets this at the start of the game, pretty much the same thing. It's like the mechanics of the game, and it from round one, it no longer affects the rest of the game. You could forget about what faction you are; it doesn't matter. And so that's why I love that. But it's more of like do you know how like you can have variant setups to games? It's kind of like that, except for each person can choose a variant setup that all work together. But at the same thing, I still think it's more fun if we just everybody remove that. And you just did it without it.
Okay. And Kira, can you think of a game that has a lot of starting factions where you think it doesn't work?
I think Gaia Project is a good example of that. In Gaia Project, it's very, very complicated to win anyway at the best of times. Having a starting faction on your mind can, even though I like the less analysis paralysis, I think that it's quite difficult to find a path to winning as it is. It doesn't need the extra burden of very complicated trying to wing in your piece and other people's pieces. And the variance in powers between those starting factions is also a pain.
Okay, so there you have it. Pros and cons on both sides. Owen, do you want to give us any closing statements against starting factions in games?
Yeah, I think, as you probably got from this podcast, there's like lots of different categories when it comes to starting factions. Like some that only affect the start of the game, the setup, some that are bonuses throughout, and some that are imbalanced. And there's loads of examples we've given. But I think we can safely say that just taking the starting powers out will usually mean increased amount of fun. But it depends. Obviously, it depends on the game and the randomness and the choice. But in most cases, just take it out. Yeah, I think if you're still struggling with a game with starting factions, take it out. Even though I was one of the person who gave an option of putting it in for Stone Age. I'm not really sure why I did that early on in the podcast. But take it out.
And Kira, have you got anything to say in favor of starting factions?
Yes, I think there's a lot of games in a lot of the genres, but particularly in worker placement, that would just become too boring without starting factions. I think that the fun element needs to come from things changing. I don't think that if a game is well tuned and there's no variance, players will just play the exact same pattern each time. And I just think that I would get bored. So I think that all of the fun comes from forcing people to do things that they weren't planning on doing so that it's different each time. And I think that their starting factions are the best.
Concise, to the point.
That's closing factions. Yeah.
So there you have it, everyone. That about wraps it up for our first debate. Did all this back and forth change your opinion on unique starting powers and advantages in games? Who do you think won the debate? Personally, as moderator,
me.
I say Brian. And since I have the final vote, Brian. Good work, Brian. Proud of you. Couldn't have done better. But do let us know. Do let us know on social media or on the podcast what you think. Who won? Was it Kira? Was it Owen? Do you like starting factions? Do you not like starting factions? You can find us everywhere. If you've enjoyed it, please share it. We have been Decking Awesome Games, and thank you for listening. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.